Hi, in this movie I want to build on the Android application we created in the previous movie. The application that we are starting with here presents the user with a login screen, and when the user enters in their email address and password, those details are sent over to a REST API for verification. When the response comes back, a toast will be displayed on the screen indicating whether or not the user has logged in successfully. So if I just demonstrate this, if I put in the user's email address, and then just press the login button, down here you see it says a toast pops up saying user SamBlogs is logged in. So it's showing me that the response has come back from the server, and I'm getting this toast message here being displayed. I'm storing the details of the user in my model object so I can access them later on. Now what I'd like to happen when the user logs in successfully is not that I just display a toast. I'd rather that I started up a new activity. So what I'd like to do is pasting in the wrong code there. Create an intent object which is going to name the activity I want to create, which will be a new activity I'm going to create now in a moment. So I need to go login activity dot this, and then I want to create an activity. We'll call it Enrollments activity. Then I got dot class, and I'll get an error there because that class doesn't exist, but we'll fix that in a moment. So then I'll just say start activity, and I pass the intent as a parameter to start activity. I don't need to give any extras to start this activity because the activity is going to get all its data from our REST API, so there's no parameters to send to it. So I'll just right click on this, go Alt Enter and say create class. I could do this. Actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it up here and use Android Studio to create a new activity, because this will put the activity into the manifest file as well, make an entry for it. So I want to create an activity, as I said, Enrollments activity. It's going to display a list of enrollments. It's not a launcher. I want it to be backwardly compatible. I want it to generate a layout file, and I'm just going to go finish. And I've misspelled that. I've called it Enrollment. It should be enrolls. Probably the best way to do this is just to rename the class. If I go refactor, rename the class Enrollments activity and go refactor, and I think that should change it in the manifest file as well. Yes, so it's made it's changed it in the manifest file as well. And just check to see, does it rename the resource files? Probably not, but maybe. It's not renamed the resource file, so I'm just going to rename that. I'm going to go right click, refactor, rename, and I want to call this Enrollments. Let's refactor that. Okay, so in my enrollment activity, so it's loading up the file activity enrollment. So at the moment that won't do anything. There's nothing in it. If I open up that file, that XML file, it's just got a constraint layout with nothing in it. But we can see that if I run the application, if I stop the old application and run it again, run this new version of it, when I log in, I should go to that blank activity. Log in, and there I am in the enrollments activity, which is blank at the moment. So we need to put some content in there. So I know that that much is working. I'm getting from one activity to the next. So in this activity, what I need to do is I need to put something into this file here. So rather than just type it out, I'm just going to paste it in from over here. I'm going to copy all this content and paste it in here. So in the enrollments, what we're going to activity layout file, we're going to have a frame layout into which I'm going to put in a fragment, and that fragment will display a recycler view. And then I'm also going to have a floating action button, which will be a button that appears down in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. So this is quite a common design pattern for Android apps. If we look at this in the design window, this is where the floating action button is. In the activity, we will get a list of enrollments being displayed, and then we'll have our plus button down in the bottom corner. The floating action button, I've given it an ID so I can refer to it. I've given the frame layout an ID so I can refer to it, so I can put some content into it. So the next thing I need to do is, in my enrollment activity, I need to get a reference to those components and configure them. So again, rather than just what we'll do is we're going to create a fragment. Where's the code for this? So in my class here, I'm going to say, okay, I want to get a reference to my frame layout. I want to create a fragment. I want to import that class. Why can't I import that? There's the import now. And then I need to create this enrollments fragment class. So rather than go Alt Enter to create this class, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my package name here. I'm going to right click on that and I'm going to go New Fragment. And I want to create a blank fragment, to create this from scratch. So I'm going to call this fragment Enrollments Fragment. Type the name but properly this time. I want it to create a layout file which will be called fragment_enrollments. I want it to include the factory methods for creating my fragment, and I want it to include the callback method. The interface callback methods are basically the way the fragment notifies the activity of events that happen within the fragment that the activity needs to be notified about. We'll explain that as we go through the code. So I'm just going to go finish here. So this creates my fragments class. So I'll go back into my package. Here's my fragment, enrollments fragments, and then it also creates my layout file, fragment enrollments, which is initially just got an empty text view with hello blank fragment in it. There's my code. So if I go in here now, this code all works. Now I go back to my fragment and I need to modify this code. So I'm just going to get rid of this comment for the moment. So when we create a fragment, we sometimes need to pass parameters to it to tell the fragment what to display. We need to pass some input into the fragment. It's like when you call a method, we need to pass parameters to the method. But in this particular case, we don't need to do that. So I don't need these constants here. These are kind of like the names for the parameters. So I don't need those. These two variables will be variables that I would store the parameter values in, but because I don't have parameters, I don't need those either. This is my my listener object. So this will be an object that listens for events that happen within the fragment itself. So for example, if somebody pressed a button or if somebody selects an item on a list. So we will have a look at this. This is an interface that's defined down at the bottom of this class. We'll look at that in a moment. We have our constructor, which is empty. We don't need these comments for the moment. I'm just going to take them out to keep the code small. And we don't need to create a bundle and pass the parameter values to the fragment in that bundle. So I can delete that code. So the new instance method, when it's called, it doesn't need any parameter values. We're just going to create it. We don't need to pass any data to it. It's just going to create an instance of enrollments fragments and return it. I'm going to take this code and put it down below the static method. That's just the way I like to organize my code. Put the static content at the top of the class and then the instance variables below it. In the onCreate method is called when the fragment is created. And this is where you would normally check to see do we have any arguments. We don't have arguments, so we don't need to retrieve them, so I can delete this code. And then in the onCreateView, this is where we actually create an instance of the enrollments fragment layout file, and we return that. So that will create our view object for this fragment. The button press method will be an example of a method that would be invoked when something happens within the fragment, such as a button being pressed. Okay, so the method that we will want to have is we're going to have a list of fragments, and we want to be notified when we're not in a list of fragments, list of enrollments. We want to be notified when one of those enrollments has been selected. So I'm going to rename this method to be OnItemSelected, and it's not going to take a URI object as a parameter, it's going to take an enrollment object as a parameter. I need to import that class in here, and then I'm going to call a method mListener.onFragmentInteraction, and I will pass the enrollment object as a parameter to this. And this method is defined in the interface, and I want to rename that method. I'm going to call it OnItem selected. Now I meant to rename this method, but somehow I must have escaped it rather than press return. So my fragment will have a class called OnItemSelected, which will take an enrollment object as a parameter. And what it will do is it'll just check to see, have I got a listener? And if I do, I'm going to call the same method on my listener object, passing the enrollment as a parameter to it. And down here, I'm going to change this method here. I'm going to call this OnItemSelected. No, it has been renamed, but I need to change the parameter to be an enrollment object. So the idea of the interface, this interface is that if something happens in the fragment that the activity needs to be notified about, well then you define an interface. The activity implements the interface. So we know that the activity will have an implementation of this method. And then the fragment will, when the fragment is created, the onAttach method is called. Okay. And in the onAttach method, context will be a reference to the activity that the fragment is being added to. And we will check to see, is that context, is that activity an instance of this interface? In other words, does it implement the interface? And if it does, we're going to store a reference to the activity in the mListener variable. Otherwise, we're going to throw an exception, basically saying that this class must implement our interface. Otherwise, we won't be able to notify it of the event that has happened within the fragment. When the fragment is removed from the activity, we set mListener to null. So just again, it's going to remove these comments to keep the code small so that it's easy to see what's going on, and then I can remove this to do comment. So this will basically, if I run this now, if I stop this and go back and run my app again, I should load up my fragment, which will just say hello blank fragment after I log in. So if I go log in here, slam@blogs.com, secret, and log in. Now that's crashed, so what have I done wrong? Okay, my activity hasn't implemented the listener interface. This is what I was saying. So this exception here is being created by this code here, because the activity that I have added this fragment to hasn't implemented that interface. So I need to go back to my enrollments activity, and I need to say that this implements enrollments fragment dot and the listener interface. Now because I said it implements that interface, this class now has to implement that method. So if I go Alt Enter here and say implement methods, it'll say, is that the method you want to implement? And I'll say yes. So now I come down here and I've got this method. And what I could do is I could just output a toast here. I'll copy a bit of code from here, save me typing it all, and paste it in here. I don't need to go login activity. I can just go this because I'm in my in an activity here, and I'll just go enrollment selected, and then the enrollment class has a toString method which will convert it to a string automatically. So I can just say enrollment selected plus enrollment, and that will call the toString method on that enrollment object. So now if I run the application again and I log in, I would see that toast being selected. If I would see that method being invoked in the toast display if I select a enrollment within the list. Now we don't have any enrollments in the list at the moment, but we'll get back to that later. Let's go log in here, and here's my blank fragment and my plus button down the bottom. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to get a list of enrollments in here. So I need to go back to my code. I'll just stop that up. I need to go back to my code. So in enrollments fragment, I create the view here in this method, but then I need to customize it. So the way I'm going to customize this is to override another method from the fragment class. And that's going to be the public void on view created method, and this takes a reference to the view that was just created, and there's another parameter for this. I just need to look it up, see what it is. I need to get my browser. Android fragment reference. If I go in here to this and go to, it's telling me to go to the support library fragment class because this class was deprecated, and then in here I just want to do a search for on view created, and it takes a bundle which is our saved instance state as a second parameter. So I'm just going to paste that in here. And now what I need to do in here is I need to configure this. Well, what do I want to do here? Well, in my fragment, in the layout file for it, I don't want to have this frame layout with a text unit. Instead, what I want is a recycler view. So rather than type that code up from scratch, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paste it in here from this file. So this is basically saying that the enrollment fragment is going to display a recycler view, and the layout file for each item in the recycler view is going to be this file here. So that file doesn't exist, so I need to create it. So I'll just go Alt Enter here and to say create layout resource file. I'll say yes, and I want it to have a constraint layout to start off with. That's okay, and there's the file. Now we'll put some content into that in a moment. So this is my recycler view. So back in my fragment file, I need to get a reference to that recycler view, and I need to configure it. So again, just to save me time typing up code, I'm going to copy a piece of code from here, and I'm going to paste it in. So, and then I just need to import all these classes. An Enrollments adapter is a class I need to create. This is the adapter for my recycler view. I'll create that. I'll just create that now and get rid of the error. And I want to create that in this package, and we'll come back to that. Now it's giving me an error because the constructor doesn't exist and because it doesn't implement the required interface. But we'll fix that in a moment. So in my create view, what I'm going to do is I'm checking to see, okay, is the view that I've got a recycler view, which it will be, because that's what's in our fragment layout. We're going to get a reference to the context for that. We're going to cast our view object into our recycler view object so we can invoke a number of methods on it. We're going to set its layout manager to be a linear layout. Then we're going to create a decorator item, which is basically going to put a divider between each row in the recycler view. It's going to be a vertical decoration. And then we're going to get a reference to our application object, and then use that to get a reference to our model object, and then from the model object we're going to retrieve the list of enrollments that we want to display. So in the model object, what we have is when the model object is created, we create an empty array list of enrollments. Okay. Now we need to populate this with some enrollments from our REST API, but we'll get back to how we do that in a moment. Having retrieved our list of enrollments, I'm then going to create my adapter object, which is basically going to create view holders for every enrollment in my list. And then we're going to set that adapter object to be the adapter for our recycler view. So this is basically how you configure a recycler view. It's the simplest kind of configuration that we need to do. So the first thing I need to do is I need to specify what's going to be in each item. So again, I'm just going to copy the code for this, and this is quite a long file. So I'm just going to go Control A, V, I'm going to paste it in here, and then we'll just discuss what's actually going on in here. So in this file, we're going to use a thing called, we're using Constraint Layout, and we have a text view. Then we have a guideline. So a guideline is like a, it's just an invisible guideline on the design window that we can use to align components. Then I have a second text view. So the first text view is going to display the date of the enrollment. The second text view is going to display the name of the course. And then the third text view is going to display the student's name. Each of these text views is configured in a similar way. They all have their width set to 0 because the width is going to be specified by using constraints. The start of the date text view is aligned with the left hand side of the parent, and then the end of it is aligned to guideline 1. Guideline 1 is this one here, and it is going to be a vertical guideline, so it's going to go down the screen, and it's going to be at 20% of the width of the screen. Then below that we have the second text view, and this is going to start at the end of this is going to be at the start of guideline 2, and the start of this is going to be at the end of guideline 1. So guideline 2 is our second guideline, which is going to be at 60% of the width of the screen. So these constraints, the start and end constraints, are specifying the width that our text views are going to be. So when we specify the width to be 0 dp, it basically means the width is going to be determined automatically. And it's these constraints, it's the constraint end and constraint start that are specifying where the left and the right hand side of the text view should be. The last text view then, the end of it, is going to be at the end of the parent, which is the right hand side of the parent, and then the start of the last text view is going to be at the start of guideline 2. So if we look at this in the design window, here's our text areas. Okay, this is guideline 1 is here, and this is guideline 2. The text for this is slightly smaller because it needs to use a smaller font so that the actual date fits into this width of the screen. For each of these text views, the width and the height of it is just set to be wrap content. And the vertical positioning of the text views is just to the bottom of the parent and to the top of the parent. Okay, so the parent is basically the constraint layout, and the constraint layout, its height is just going to be wrap content. So that's basically the way the layout for each item in our recycler view is going to be. So now what I need to do is I need to configure my RecyclerView adapter, my enrollments adapter, to use that layout. So in the enrollments adapter, I've just got this blank class. Now this class needs to implement an interface. So if I go over here and I click on this, it'll say I need to create a constructor which takes a reference to the required parameters. So it's going to take a reference to my enrollments fragment. I'll call it enrollments fragment. It's going to take a reference to my list of enrollments. We'll call it enrollments, and that's fine. And then I will just store these in 2 instance variables. And I'll just create those instance variables. I go Alt Enter, create those as fields, and Alt Enter on this, and I'll create that as a field as well. And that's that syntax error sorted out. Now down here I have another syntax error because the adapter that I pass into RecyclerView adapter, that needs to implement an interface. So if I go Alt Enter here, it says make enrollments adapter extends the class RecyclerView adapter. So if I go yes to that, it means that it needs to implement a number of methods. So if it should go OK. Now in here I can say that I can see that what it's done is it's asking me to implement 3 methods: the onCreateViewholder, the onBindViewholder, and then itemcount. The item count is the easiest of the 3, so we'll do this first. Item count is basically how many items have we got in our adapter. How many views do we need to create, in other words. And this is just going to be whatever the size of our enrollments is. So enrollments is a list, so I'm just going to return whatever the size of that list is. And that's the number of items that we need to create. The onCreateViewholder needs to create an object of type RecyclerViewholder, or something that is a subclass of RecyclerViewholder. And normally what you do in your adapter class is you create an inner class, a class within enrollments adapter, which implements, which is a subclass of RecyclerViewholder. So again, rather than type all that code up, I'm just going to paste it in from over here. I just pick out the file. Here's my class. So I'm just going to paste this in here. And I just need to import some files. So what the Viewholder does is it basically says when we create it, we give it a reference to a view, and the view that we give it a reference to is going to be one of these items here. So each view is going to be, the Viewholder is going to be a reference to one of these. There's going to be one of these for each item in our list. And what we need to do is get a reference to each of the text views within this component so that I can get the data from our enrollment and put it into each of these text views. So in our adapter, what we do is we create a view holder, and the view holder basically stores a reference to the entire view itself. So that's the constraint layout. And then it gets a reference to the 3 text views that are inside it, and it stores those. And then finally it'll also store a reference to the enrollment object, which is the source of the data for this view. So when I create my view holder object, I give it a reference to the view object, and then I just search within that view object for the data that I need. This variable, the enrollment variable, will be set later on when we're binding the view holder to a particular position within our list of enrollments. So this is my view holder class. So now I want to use this down here. So the onCreateViewHolder method takes a reference to a view group. I'm just going to rename this because this is basically our parent. So this is the recycler view that the view items are going to be installed in. And the variable I there doesn't really tell you what this is. This is basically for, this is a type variable which we're not going to use. So what I need to do in this class is I basically need to inflate my XML file and return a reference to that. So I'm just going to copy this code and paste it in here. So I'm going to get a inflator object, and then I'm going to use the inflator object to inflate my enrollment items layout file. And then that will give me a view object, and that view object is basically going to be a constraint layout that contains all this stuff. And then where am I going? Into my adapter. I'm going to put that view object inside a view holder. So the view holder will then basically cache references to the different text views that are inside the constraint layout, and then I'm going to return that view holder. The view holder then needs to be bound to a particular enrollment. So what we do here is we give it a reference to a view holder object. This method takes a reference to a view holder object and a variable I. And the I is basically an index or a position within our list of enrollments that we want to bind this view holder to. So I know that the object that I have here is an instance of this class view holder here, which is a subclass of this. So what I get in here will actually be an instance of this view holder class rather than this one. So the code that I need to configure this is just this code here. So I'm just going to paste this code in here, and you can see that I'm getting an error here saying that this symbol date view is undefined because Android Studio thinks that viewholder is an instance of this class RecyclerView.viewholder, but it's actually an instance of a subclass of that. It's the subclass that I create up here, this class here. When I make this change, I get another error because now it's kind of complaining that it's saying that in here, if I go Alt Enter, it's saying that this class doesn't implement the methods of RecyclerView Adapter. This class has some abstract methods that this class here needs to implement. And the method that it's complaining about that's not been implemented is this one here. Because we're now saying that onViewBinder takes an instance of viewholder, my inner class. It takes this object as a parameter. Whereas this declaration, the way I've declared it, it's expecting one of these objects as a parameter. So what I need to do is I need to tell the adapter, I need to say it's not extending the adapter object and using this view holder. Okay, I need to tell it it's going to extend this adapter object and use this as a view holder. So the way I do that is just in angle brackets I go Enrollments Adapter dot view holder, and that gets rid of the syntax error. Now down here, well, basically what this is saying is that this object is going to, the adapter object, the onView the onCreateViewholder is going to return an instance of this class rather than an instance of this class. So this needs to be changed to say we're just going to return a viewholder object. And that gets rid of my syntax error. So now I'm in here, and in my onViewBinder, on bind viewholder, what I need to do is I need to take this viewholder, which has a reference to a view object and the various text views in it, and a position, and I need to use that position to retrieve an enrollment object from our list of enrollments, and then I need to take the information from that enrollment object and store it in the various text views, and then I'm going to give the viewholder a reference to the enrollment object that it's bound to. Then I'm going to get a reference to the entire view object. So mView here is basically a reference to the constraint layout. So that's the entire row, if you like, or item within my RecyclerView. I'm going to add an onClick listener. So if I click on one of those items, this onClick method will be invoked. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, we've got a reference to our fragment object. We're going to call the OnItemSelected method saying call this method passing the enrollment that was selected in as a parameter. And what that does is that means we go into our fragment and we say, have we got a listener? If we have, which will be our activity, call the OnItemSelected method within our activity, which means that we'll go up to our activity, and this method here will be invoked, which means that we will display a toast saying, here's the enrollment that was selected. But that action is being executed in the activity. Why is that important? The reason why that's important is because when we select an enrollment in our list, we want to go to a new activity which will display the details of that enrollment. And because we're going from one activity to another, the code to do that should be up at the activity class rather than in the fragment class. That's just a convention that you should follow when you're writing Android apps. So this basically sets up our adapter, but when we run it, we're going to have an empty list because we don't have any enrollments. So what I now need to do is I now need to say, okay, we need to load the enrollments from our REST API. So I'm going to go model.load enrollments. I don't have this method, but I'm going to say I want to load my enrollments, and when you're finished, I want you to invoke a method on a listener object. So I'm going to create a new API listener, abstract API listener, and I'm going to specify the method that I want invoked. Now here I get a syntax error because I say, hey, look, the model class doesn't have a method called load enrollments that takes an API listener as a parameter. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go Alt Enter and say, well, make that method in the model. So this method in the model class, what it needs to do is basically use the API to load up the enrollments and then invoke the listener object when we've got the result. So what I'm going to do here is actually I've got the data type for this. This should just be API listener. I can make that. Just call that listener. Keep it the same as what I'm doing up here with the login. So I'm just passing in a listener object. So API listener is my interface. So what I need to do now is go API dot load enrollments. So I'm going to ask my API object. The model object is basically delegating to the API object to load the enrollments and notify this listener object when you get them, when the enrollments arrive. So if I now go right click on this and says, well, we don't have a load enrollments method inside the API class, but if I just go Alt Enter and say create the method in the API, so that basically goes up to my interface, because as far as the model class is concerned, this is just an interface that I'm dealing with. So that creates this method load enrollments in the interface. So when I do this, if I now go to the API module and I go into Web API, now Web API has a problem because it doesn't implement that method I've just added to the interface. So I say, okay, we'll go and implement that method. Okay, so now I've got this empty method down here in my web API listener, and I need to add some code into this. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm just going to paste some code in here to save me typing it all out. This is the code I need. And we'll just discuss what's going on here. So here's our method. Now, the first thing I got is this syntax error that needs to be dealt with, because here it's complaining, saying that listener needs to be made final because I'm going to access that variable inside an event handler. And then it's saying, hey, listener doesn't have a method called onEnrollments loaded, which takes a list of enrollments as a parameter. So I'm just going to go Alt Enter and say, well, create that method in my API listener. So my API listener is just the interface that needs to be implemented by listener objects. And then my class abstract API listener declares that it implements this interface, but it doesn't actually implement that method I just added. So I go Alt Enter there and say implement that method, and we just add in an empty implementation of that method, which is all I want to do here, because I'm going to override this in a subclass in my adapter. So if I go back to my web API, which is here, and let's just have a look at what's going on in my code. So let's fix that syntax error here. So what's going on here is, when we call load enrollments, we need to send a request to our REST API. We need to send a request to API/enrollments. I'm going to create a success response listener, which will have a method called onResponse, and this is invoked when we get a successful response back from the REST API, and that will have a JSON array inside it. So in the enrollment class, I have added in a method. I don't know why it's doing that. I've added in a method which takes a reference to a JSON array as a parameter, and it returns a list of enrollment objects. Okay, so we're going to loop through our JSON array, retrieving each object out of it, and then we're going to pass that JSON object into enrollment.getEnrollment, which will return me an enrollment object. If we look at the content that we get back from our REST API, you'll see that as well as getting the details of the enrollment, I also get the details of the course that the enrollment is associated with, and I get the details of the student that's associated with that course. So in my code, when I'm decoding an enrollment object, not only do I get the student ID and the course ID, but I also get the details of the student and the course. So here I can say, go into my JSON object, which basically represents all this content here. And inside that JSON object, there's a property called course, which should be a course object. Okay, so I want to get that JSON object that represents that property, and I want you to extract from that JSON object a course variable. So in the course class, I have a method called getCourse, which extracts the various properties from our JSON object and makes a course object and returns it. I also have a method called getCourses, which takes a JSON array and returns an array of courses. The student class is similar. It's got a getStudent object, which extracts a student object from a JSON object, and then it's got a getStudents method, which extracts a list of students from a JSON array. So in my web API class, I'm basically going to use that. I'm going to go enrollment.getEnrollments from my response, which is a JSON array. That gives me back an array of enrollment objects. And then I check to see, hey, do we have a listener that wants to be notified of this response? If we do, call the onEnrollments loaded method from that on that listener object, passing the list of enrollments in as a parameter. If something goes wrong, I'm just going to display an error message using a toast. If I get an error response from my REST API, well, then I'm just going to again display an error message. Now, so there are my two my two listener objects. Having created the two listener objects, now I'm ready to create the request object. So I'm sending a request, and I expect the response to that request to be a JSON array. So now I'm going to send a JSON array request. I'm setting a GET request. I've specified the URL. The URL is my base URL /API/enrollments. The body of the request is null because it's empty. Here's my success listener. Here's my error listener. Now, this will basically create an instance of the JSON array request class, but I actually need to create a subclass of that because I need to override the method getHeaders because I need to add some headers to this. In particular, I need to add my authorization header, which contains the user's token, because I cannot send a request to the API enrollments URL if I'm not logged in. So I need to send an authorization token saying this is who I'm logged in as, or here's the token for the person that I'm logged in as. And the way I do that is I basically create a subclass of JSON array request and I override the getHeaders method. So now I've got my request object and I add that to the request queue. That request will be processed in the background, and when the response comes back, assuming it's a successful response, I would invoke this method on my listener object. So where does the listener object come from? Well, this method, load enrollment, is called from our model object. And our model object receives the listener object from wherever load enrollment is called in the model object. And load enrollment in our model object is called from within our adapter. So, no, it's in our fragment, enrollment fragment. So down here we're saying, okay, I want to create a subclass of abstract API listener. Why do I use abstract API listener? The reason why I do that is because I don't want to have to define this method. Okay, I'm not using this method here, so I want to create a subclass of this where this method is just empty, but I'm going to override this method here. I'm going to put some code into that method. So in my fragment, what I need to do is override that method. Let me just copy the URL for it. Not the URL, the signature for it. I'm going to paste that in here. And then in here, I can write the code that I want to have executed when the list of enrollments comes back from the REST API. And what do I want to do with this list of enrollments? Well, what I'd like to do is take this list of enrollments and put them into this list of enrollments. But these two kind of have the same variable name, so that's going to cause a bit of a problem. So I'm just going to rename this variable, and I'm going to call it loaded enrollment. Okay, so that's the list of enrollments I've loaded from the REST API. So I want to take whatever list of enrollments I currently have, and I want to empty that list out. Then I want to go enrollments.add all, and I want to specify loaded enrollments. So I want to take all the enrollment objects that are in this collection or in this list, and I want to add them to this list. And having done that, I now need to notify my adapter that its data set has changed. Because my adapter object is basically displaying whatever in this list, because that's the way I created my adapter object. So when the content of this list changes, I need to notify the adapter that that has happened. So if I run this, I should get the list of enrollments getting displayed on the screen. I've got a syntax error here. I failed to do something right. Enrollments fragments has an error, which is up here. So the class OR hasn't been defined, and usually that's because there's an error in one of my XML files. Doesn't seem to be one here. So I'm just going to do a clean build, or rebuild the project. and see if that fixes the error. So the error it's saying is attribute layout manager. I've seen this before and I'm not quite sure. So it's this attribute here, it's saying it doesn't find this attribute. We don't actually need to specify our layout manager because that's going to be done when we configure the recycler view. So I'm just going to save that, and if I go to run it again, it'll rebuild it. And here is my app, and if I log in, now I'm getting a JSON exception. This is an intermittent error that I've been getting with this app, and I think the problem is with the text that's in the database. There are some characters in there that are conflicting with the that are causing problems with the JSON decoder. You can see I'm getting a JSON exception, so I'm not quite sure what to do about this. I think the problem is with a character, as I said, in the database. So what I'm going to try and do is debug this. I'm going to go to the Web API. I'm going to put a breakpoint in here where I get the response back in the success listener, and another breakpoint in where I get the error response back. Just debug the code and see what happens. So I go sam@logs.com and log in. So this time it works. As I said, it's an intermittent error, but there you can see we're getting our list of enrollments from our database. If I scroll down through that, you can see all the enrollments there. And that's basically all we needed to do to get it displayed. There's an intermittent error there. I'll have to look into that, but I'm going to leave it at that for the moment. I think the problem isn't so much with the code, it's with the content of the database. So I'm going to stop there.